June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. Normandy's beaches lay in deceptive calm. The German defenders had spent months fortifying the coastline. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches, and tangled barbed wire stretched as far as the eye could see. They believed these defenses could hold any assault, even from tanks. Yet the Allies were preparing an attack that would test the very limits of German fortifications. Across the English Channel, the first waves of landing craft moved silently through the early morning mist. On board, American Sherman tanks waited, engines rumbling beneath armored hulls, poised to enter a battlefield they had never seen. Each Sherman carried a 75mm gun, machine guns, and armor capable of withstanding small arms fire and light anti-tank weapons. They were not the heaviest tanks in the war, but their combination of mobility, firepower, and numbers would soon make them a nightmare for the German defenders. In the hours before dawn, Allied intelligence officers briefed Sherman crews, explaining the layout of German defenses, reinforced bunkers, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and key strongpoints. The plan was precise. Tanks would lead the assault, crushing wire and obstacles, firing on pillboxes, and providing cover for the infantry that would follow. Artillery ships offshore would bombard known strongpoints minutes before the landing, and fighter planes would strafe positions to disrupt communications. Coordination was key. Any breakdown could mean disaster. On the German side, soldiers patrolled their fortifications under the dim moonlight. Some joked nervously about the coming invasion. Others tightened their belts around anti-tank weapons and inspected Panzerfausts and 88mm guns. None could fully imagine the scale and speed of what was approaching. They were about to witness the Sherman tank in action, a machine that would challenge every assumption about static defenses. As dawn broke, the coastline transformed. Silhouettes of bunkers emerged from the mist, and the first landing craft approached the sand. Sherman tanks, loaded onto these vessels, were poised to strike. The commanders knew that their armored units would face mines, obstacles, and intense fire, but these tanks were designed for this very moment. They would roll through everything, sometimes surviving direct hits that would destroy lesser vehicles. The psychological effect on both sides was palpable. American crews gripped their controls, hearts pounding, eyes scanning the horizon for German fortifications. German soldiers, meanwhile, had yet to hear the first shots, but the tension was unbearable. They did not know that the Sherman tanks, with their mobility and firepower, would soon appear on the beaches like unstoppable steel beasts, turning bunkers and defensive lines into rubble in a matter of minutes.
At 6:30 a.m., the first Sherman tanks rolled off the landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy. Steel treads crushed obstacles, and 75mm cannons fired the first shots into German bunkers. The sound was deafening, a mix of artillery, exploding concrete, and machine gun fire. Smoke and sand erupted around each impact as the Sherman tanks pressed forward, fearless and relentless. German defenders were shocked. Their bunkers, long considered impregnable, were crumbling under fire. Panzerfaust teams tried to halt the advance, firing at the tanks from behind sandbags and walls, but Sherman's armor held. Machine guns mounted on the tanks shredded German infantry, while high-explosive shells demolished fortified positions. Tanks moved in coordinated waves, supporting each other and clearing lanes for the following infantry. The beach became a chaotic battlefield. Mines exploded beneath retreating vehicles, sandbags flew into the air, and the screams of men mixed with the roar of engines. Sherman tanks proved their value not through brute armor alone, but through mobility and firepower, combined with precise coordination. Every bunker that fell created a ripple effect, breaking defensive lines and causing panic among German soldiers. Artillery from offshore ships maintained constant bombardment, targeting known strongpoints and preventing German reinforcements from organizing. German fighter planes strafed machine gun nests and anti-tank positions, adding to the confusion. German officers attempted to regroup, but the assault was too fast, too coordinated. Messages were delayed, units isolated, and morale collapsed under the relentless pressure. By mid-morning, Sherman tanks had advanced several hundred meters inland. Concrete bunkers lay in rubble, barbed wire twisted and broken, and German soldiers were retreating in disarray. Infantry followed closely behind the tanks, taking advantage of the gaps created. The combination of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support demonstrated a level of coordination the German defenders had never experienced. The psychological effect was immediate. German soldiers who had trained for years under the assumption that their defenses were nearly invulnerable were stunned by the speed and effectiveness of the Sherman assault. Officers reported that tanks seemed to appear from nowhere, emerging from the waves like unstoppable steel monsters. Fear spread faster than the shells and bullets. Within hours, what had been a solid defensive line became a series of isolated pockets, each struggling to survive. Each Sherman that survived the initial barrage increased pressure on the German lines. Infantry could advance, engineers could clear obstacles, and artillery could target new positions. The combination of speed, firepower, and coordination made the Sherman tanks the key to the breakthrough. By mid-noon, critical points along the beach had been secured, and Sherman tanks were pushing inland, threatening supply lines, command posts, and secondary defensive positions. The Germans were stunned. Sherman tanks were not just machines. They were symbols of industrial might, tactical innovation, and combined arms warfare. The beach, which had been the foundation of German confidence, was now a battlefield where mobility, coordination, and relentless assault determined survival. Normandy would never be the same.
By late morning, the German defenders were in full shock. The Sherman tanks had smashed through the initial defensive lines, rolling over barbed wire, exploding mines, and demolishing concrete bunkers. Panzer IVs and Tiger tanks attempted to counterattack, but the terrain favored the Americans. Muddy, cratered beaches and bombed-out roads limited maneuverability for the heavier German tanks, while Sherman tanks moved with surprising speed and coordination. German soldiers were disoriented. Officers tried to regroup units, but radio communications were disrupted by shell fire, and the incessant roar of engines made command nearly impossible. Soldiers reported seeing tanks appear from unexpected directions, supported by infantry and artillery, firing relentlessly on defensive positions. The Germans were trained to expect assaults from the sea, but the pace, coordination, and determination of the Shermans were beyond anything they had imagined. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. Many soldiers froze in place, unsure whether to fire, retreat, or surrender. Machine gun teams were cut down, bunkers reduced to rubble, and strongpoints that had held for months collapsed within minutes. German commanders described a surreal sense of helplessness. Their defenses, carefully constructed over months, were being torn apart by a force they had underestimated. Meanwhile, Sherman tanks continued to advance inland. Their 75mm cannons obliterated fortified positions, while coaxial machine guns mowed down infantry hiding in craters or behind walls. Artillery from Allied ships targeted known strongpoints, preventing the Germans from consolidating their positions. Fighter planes strafed troop concentrations and disrupted communications further. Each Sherman tank that survived added pressure, creating gaps for infantry to exploit. The pace of the assault was relentless. Sherman tanks moved from bunker to bunker, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in larger groups, each providing cover for the others. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles in real time, ensuring that no tank was slowed for long. The Germans attempted ambushes, firing Panzerfausts and grenades from hidden positions, but the combination of firepower, mobility, and coordination of the Shermans rendered these efforts mostly ineffective. By midday, the Germans were in disarray. Many defensive positions had been abandoned, and retreating soldiers were caught in crossfires. Communications between units broke down entirely, and reinforcements struggled to reach the front lines. The Sherman tanks had not only broken physical defenses, they had shattered morale. Reports from German officers noted widespread panic, confusion, and disbelief. They could not comprehend how relatively light tanks could advance so quickly, withstand fire, and coordinate so effectively with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Americans were seizing control of critical points, road junctions, small towns, and bridges. Each Sherman tank that survived the initial assault became a spearhead for the next push. German soldiers, once confident behind concrete bunkers and minefields, were forced to retreat under fire or surrender. Within hours, what had been considered a solid defensive line had become a series of isolated pockets, easily targeted and destroyed. By early afternoon, the Sherman tanks had reached the infamous Atlantic Wall, the series of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified strongpoints that Germany had constructed to repel an Allied invasion. Months of preparation had gone into making these defenses nearly impervious. Steel-reinforced concrete, hidden machine gun nests, and camouflaged artillery positions created a formidable line that had been considered almost unbreakable. Yet the Shermans pressed on. Each tank used its 75mm cannon with precision, targeting embrasures and firing high-explosive shells directly into bunkers. Smoke and fire billowed from the shattered fortifications. Engineers followed closely behind, clearing obstacles and mines, while infantry advanced through the gaps the tanks created. Sherman tanks were mobile fortresses, rolling through the Atlantic Wall with calculated aggression. The German defenders were stunned. Bunkers that had once seemed invincible crumbled under the concentrated fire. Machine gun crews were pinned down or eliminated. Panzerfaust teams tried desperate counterattacks, firing from hidden trenches or behind rubble, but the Sherman's armor and coordinated tactics rendered these attacks largely ineffective. Every bunker destroyed, every wire cut, every strong point neutralized, amplified the psychological impact on the Germans. Confidence turned to panic. Air support played a crucial role. Fighter bombers strafed open positions, targeted artillery, and disrupted reinforcements attempting to reach the front. Ships offshore continued their bombardment, focusing on fortified points and troop concentrations. German officers were forced to make split-second decisions while under constant fire. Coordination between units broke down completely. Orders went unheeded. Soldiers retreated or surrendered in confusion. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German strength, was being dismantled in hours. Sherman tanks moved methodically, bunker by bunker, clearing paths for infantry. Infantry squads exploited the gaps, securing positions that would allow engineers to dismantle remaining obstacles. Each Sherman tank became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. German soldiers reported feeling trapped, unable to find cover, and unable to mount effective resistance. The combination of firepower, mobility, and coordination of the Shermans created a sense of inevitability. The Allies were breaking through. By late afternoon, several kilometers of coastline had been breached. Sherman tanks rolled past destroyed bunkers, through twisted barbed wire, and into the hinterlands of Normandy.
German counterattacks were sporadic and uncoordinated. The tanks had disrupted their entire defensive network. Officers reported units scattering, sometimes abandoning heavy weapons and vehicles. Sherman tanks, supported by infantry, artillery, and aircraft, were no longer just assaulting positions, they were shattering the German defensive doctrine in real time. The effect was more than tactical, it was psychological. German soldiers who had believed the Atlantic Wall to be impregnable now faced a reality of relentless armored assault. Panic, confusion, and disbelief spread along the coast. Officers attempted to rally troops, but the combination of speed, firepower, and coordination of the Shermans left few options. By evening, key strongpoints along the beach had fallen, and Sherman tanks continued their push inland, paving the way for further Allied advances. Normandy was now firmly under Allied momentum, and the Germans were stunned, struggling to respond to an assault that had proven faster, more coordinated, and more devastating than they had imagined possible.
By the late afternoon, Sherman tanks had pushed several kilometers inland from the beaches of Normandy. The once formidable German defenses were in disarray, and the speed of the Allied advance left the German High Command struggling to coordinate a response. Reinforcements were delayed, units were isolated, and the psychological impact on German soldiers was devastating. Sherman tanks moved like iron waves through the countryside, their 75mm cannons firing relentlessly at remaining fortifications, machine gun nests, and suspected enemy positions. Infantry followed closely, clearing the wreckage of destroyed bunkers and neutralizing any surviving resistance. Engineers dismantled obstacles and cleared mines, ensuring that the armored advance never slowed. Every Sherman that survived became a focal point for further action, spearheading attacks and drawing enemy fire away from the infantry. German soldiers, many of them exhausted and demoralized from hours of relentless bombardment, began to retreat under pressure. Panzer crews attempted counterattacks, firing from concealed positions or attempting flanking maneuvers, but the coordination of Sherman tanks, artillery, and air support rendered these efforts largely ineffective. The Germans were witnessing firsthand the combination of mobility, firepower, and tactical innovation that had shattered the Atlantic Wall. The chaos was compounded by Allied artillery and airstrikes. Battleships offshore continued to pound known German positions, while fighter planes strafed retreating soldiers, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements. German officers struggled to issue orders amidst the cacophony of explosions, gunfire, and engine noise. Communication breakdowns caused units to act independently, often retreating into each other's lines or abandoning equipment in the confusion. The once orderly German defenses were unraveling with terrifying speed. Sherman tanks excelled in this chaos. Their armor allowed them to withstand Panzerfausts and small-caliber anti-tank fire, while their speed and firepower enabled them to exploit gaps in the German lines. Infantry could advance under the protective fire of tanks, capturing critical positions that had previously been considered unassailable. Every bunker neutralized, every wire cut, and every destroyed enemy vehicle increased the sense of inevitability. The Allies were unstoppable. By evening, Sherman tanks had penetrated deep into the Normandy countryside. Road junctions, farmhouses, and small villages that had served as defensive strongpoints for the Germans were now in Allied hands. Survivors reported seeing tanks appear seemingly from nowhere, flanking positions and supporting infantry with precise, relentless fire. Panic spread among German units, morale collapsed, and organized resistance began to crumble. The sheer coordination between armored units, infantry, artillery, and air support demonstrated the revolutionary nature of Allied combined arms tactics.
Sherman tanks were not just weapons of destruction, they were force multipliers, enabling infantry and artillery to operate effectively while breaking enemy morale. By the end of the day, key areas inland from the beaches had been secured, and the Germans were left stunned and disorganized, struggling to comprehend how relatively light tanks had caused such devastation. Sherman tanks had proven that mobility, coordination, and relentless aggression could overcome even the most formidable static defenses. Normandy, once a symbol of German strength, had become a battlefield dominated by the unstoppable advance of American armored forces.
By evening, the beaches of Normandy and several kilometers inland had fallen under Allied control. Sherman tanks, battle-worn but relentless, continued to push forward, securing villages, road junctions, and strategic positions. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, German defenses shattered, and the psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was devastating. Soldiers and officers alike were stunned by the sheer effectiveness of the Sherman assault. The German High Command struggled to comprehend what had happened. Months of careful planning, fortification, and training had been undone in a single day. Officers reported entire units abandoning positions, artillery left unmanned, and command posts overrun. Panzer divisions, designed to repel armored assaults, had been unable to respond effectively due to the rapid advance and coordination of Sherman tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. Sherman crews surveyed the battlefield with grim determination. Their tanks bore scars from mines, small arms fire, and the occasional lucky Panzerfaust hit. Yet each vehicle that remained operational represented a decisive advantage. Infantry moved behind them, consolidating gains, clearing pockets of resistance, and securing routes for reinforcements. Engineers repaired bridges, cleared roads, and ensured that no obstacle could slow the armored advance. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. Concrete bunkers had been reduced to rubble, barbed wire twisted and torn, and German strongpoints annihilated. Sherman tanks, combined with relentless artillery bombardment and air support, had made the German defensive network almost irrelevant. Where confidence and preparation had once ruled, fear and disbelief now dominated. German soldiers were retreating in disarray, unable to mount an organized defense. Allied commanders understood the significance of the Sherman's role. These tanks had not only destroyed physical defenses, they had broken the German will to resist. Infantry and artillery could exploit every gap created by Sherman tanks, maintaining relentless pressure. Air support ensured that no regrouping could take place. By nightfall, the Allies had achieved a foothold that would serve as the launching point for the liberation of France. German reports captured the sheer shock of the day. Commanders described the Sherman tanks as seemingly invincible, able to appear from unexpected angles and withstand hits that would destroy lesser vehicles. Soldiers who had relied on bunkers and minefields for survival now found themselves exposed, pursued, and overwhelmed. The combination of speed, firepower, coordination, and sheer persistence of Sherman tanks had created a battlefield where German doctrine and planning no longer applied. For the Allies, the victory was strategic and symbolic. Normandy was now a staging ground for further operations, but more importantly, the Sherman had proven itself as a decisive tool of war. Mobility, combined with firepower and coordination, allowed relatively light tanks to overcome formidable defenses, crush morale, and enable infantry and artillery to exploit every success. By the end of D-Day, Sherman tanks had rewritten the rules of the battlefield, leaving German forces stunned, demoralized, and on the defensive.
Germany, shocked and stunned, faced the realization that static defenses alone could no longer hold against a fast, coordinated, and relentless armored assault.